Good day, everyone. Welcome to Education 501 with the course title Philosophical and Sociological Foundations of Education. And this video lecture is intended for my students in the graduate school at Eastern Visayas State University who are taking the course Master of Arts in Education. And then in my previous lecture that I uploaded to Moodle, please take note that I employed blended learning modality in my class in the graduate school. So it's a combination of face-to-face classes and pre-recorded lectures that are uploaded to Moodle. So in Eastern Visayas State University, we use Moodle as our learning management system. So in my previous lecture or lectures, I discuss about the meaning, nature, and dynamics of education. The links to that lecture is provided below, and then in the description box below, and then the latest video lecture that I produced, that I recorded, is on the meaning of education. So there were discussions on pre-recorded discussions on the meaning of philosophy, the meaning, nature, and dynamics of philosophy, and the meaning, nature, and characteristics and types of education. Because again, the course is Philosophical Foundations of Education, or Philosophical Sociological Foundations of Education. So we need to know first and foremost what really philosophy is and what really education is before we discuss very briefly the topic, how does philosophy ground education, or in what sense that philosophy serves as the foundation of education. And in my next video lecture, I will talk about the meaning and development of sociology as a discipline. And then I will record another lecture on how does sociology ground education, or in what way that sociology serves as the foundation of education. So in this lecture, I'll focus only on the philosophical foundations of education. So let's dive right into the discussion. So how does philosophy ground education? Before I answer the specificity of this question, let us revisit our understanding of philosophy and then our understanding of education as well. So as we can see in the previous lecture, we define philosophy as a science that studies beings in their ultimate causes, reasons, and principles through the aid of human reason alone. So I explained there that philosophy deals with everything, material or immaterial, anything that can be conceived by the human mind. We call that beings. And we study their causes, their reasons, and principles through the aid of reason alone. And I also emphasize in the discussion that that understanding of philosophy, that formal definition of philosophy was actually framed, developed, or initiated, formulated rather, by Aristotle, this very famous ancient Greek philosopher, and then developed by Saint Thomas Aquinas in the medieval periods. And then Paul Glenn, a famous Catholic philosopher, framed in a formal manner the definition of philosophy. So it is Paul Glenn, that once and for all defines philosophy as a science that studies beings in the ultimate causes, reasons, and principles through the aid of human reason alone. So for more on the meaning or definition and branches of philosophy, please refer to my other lectures on this. And then education in the previous video lecture as well is defined as the purposeful process of guiding and drawing out the intellectual, moral, emotional, and physical developments of an individual so that they may achieve self-fulfillment and contribute constructively to society. So I wish to emphasize this a bit, that education involves, the process of guiding and drawing out. So if we go back to the video lecture on the definition of education, we learned that education comes from the two Latin words educare, which means to bring out or to nurture, and edusere, which means to draw out. So education is both guiding our students, um, instructing them about, let's say, mathematical formulas or anything specific, scientific or technical knowledge, so that they learn, how to solve real world problems. So in that sense, educare, the teacher, the professor, certified teachers in this case, for example, provide the um, um, the guidance for students to learn. So in this case, in the educare, in the nurturing of the child, it seems to be teacher-centered because we provide scientific knowledge that students can hardly learn on their own. So they need the guidance, they need the proper instruction from certified or qualified teachers or professor guiding educare. Eduseri, on the other hand, is drawing out what is latent within, what is latent in students themselves. So in this case, it's student centered, So after we guide students, provide them with instruction provided by, of course, qualified teachers or professors, this time we allow the students to actualize their potentialities, the latent capabilities within themselves. And in that sense, education is viewed as edusere. It's the act of drawing out what is latent within the students themselves. Um, yeah, so much for a brief revisit on the definition of philosophy and education. We will now proceed to answering the question, how does philosophy ground education, or in what sense that philosophy serves as the foundation of education? So, simply put, philosophy is the foundation of education, as it provides education, as it provides the latter, the essential principles, values, and frameworks that guides its purpose, processes, and content. This is because when we speak of the philosophical foundations of education, we refer to the underlying belief systems, theories of knowledge, conceptions of human nature, and notions of the good life that inform and guide educational practice and policy. So, left on their own without the guidance of philosophy, education can hardly, develop its theories of knowledge or formulate theories of knowledge and conceptions of human nature and the notion of the good life. And we know very well that one of the goals, one of the ends of education is to produce a well-rounded individual, you know, that have mastery on the theoretical concepts about a specific discipline like engineering or other technical scientific discipline. But also at the same time, in terms of holistic education, students must also be trained in the moral aspects, psychological, emotional aspects, which can hardly be delivered by education itself. So in this case, philosophy and education work hand in hand in the production, or in the not necessarily production, in forming a well-rounded individual. Okay, so again, philosophy is very important in education because it serves as the scaffolding, the underpins, education per se. So let me specifically explain or discuss now in what way philosophy grounds education. So specifically, philosophy serves as the foundation of education in the following ways. First, philosophy defines or helps define the aims and purpose of education. Indeed, philosophy answers the fundamental question, why do we educate? Now, the question of why in this case, why do we educate? Why do we educate is first and foremost the business of philosophy. So again, education can hardly make sense of this question without the principles, the theories that philosophy can provide. Okay. Because normally if we talk about, for example, the training of the child in the elementary and the high school, most of the time, we do the spoon feeding and we do mostly memorization of facts and figures, and the understanding of critical thinking in a sense is, um, 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 is the ability of the students to understand, analyze, and interpret. So that's primarily how we view education in that sense. So there is this in our system, in the Philippine educational system, for example, in the primary and secondary level, especially in the primary and secondary level, we just spoon feed, provide students with the know-how, with the knowledge and skills about history, about mathematics, about science. But we do not yet at that level ask the question, why do we educate them? We don't teach we don't normally teach them some philosophical moral values that students must learn. That is why education must, address this question. Why do we educate? What is the purpose of the teacher in the classroom? And what would be, the ideal goal of education that we are supposed to, inculcate in the minds of our students, in addition to the memorization of facts and figures. So we also need to ask the question again, why do we educate? And philosophy provides not necessarily the absolute answer, but some perspectives, some lenses, some theoretical guides in answering the question. So this explains why we discuss in this course, Philosophical and Sociological Foundations of Education, different philosophical schools, like the famous essentialism. I'm sure you're quite familiar with this philosophical doctrine. I'm sure you discussed this in your undergraduate years. And then we also have realism, we have idealism, we have perennialism, pragmatism, constructivism, and existentialism. So these are just some of the isms, the famous philosophical doctrines that teachers um, appropriate in answering philosophical questions in education. Like the question again, why do we educate? Now, if we ask the question, for example, why do we educate in answering the question, for example, appropriating the pragmatist perspective, pragmatism as a philosophical foundation. In this case of education, we may say a pragmatist philosophy emphasizes learning by doing, and this shapes the curriculum that focuses on real-world problem solving. I'm sure you're very familiar with John Dewey, one of the forerunners of pragmatic education in the United States. So in pragmatism, in Dewey's pragmatic philosophy of education, there is the emphasis on learning by doing. And with that philosophical lens, we develop the curriculum based on that philosophical lens. And then that informs again the the formulation, the crafting of the curriculum in a pragmatic education that again focuses on solving real world problems. Okay, so the importance again of pragmatism, of existentialism, and other philosophical doctrines, because again, this guides, the purpose and aim of education, and it provides the answer to the question as to why we educate. Second, philosophy helps shape the curriculum and contents of education. We're not saying that it's coming from us, but at least, philosophy and education work hand in hand in 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 the crafting of the curriculum and the development of the contents of education. Yeah, it's of course it's not exclusive to education, to philosophy alone, but again, philosophy helps significantly, in shaping a meaningful, effective curriculum and content of education. Indeed, philosophical beliefs shape what should be taught. For example, in the case of realism, another famous philosophical doctrine, another famous foundation, another famous philosophical doctrine that serves as foundation of education, realism. This emphasizes the importance of the physical world and practical knowledge, focusing on teaching students about reality as it exists independently of their minds. And so why do we have a lot of, let me just do some side discussion on why do we have a lot of philosophical doctrines like realism, idealism, pragmatism. And this is because um, um, personality and perspectives and opinions are diverse. So there's not just one doctrine that we can follow and we say, hey, this is a one size fits all doctrine. So depending on the context and background, like for example, in the United States, they're very pragmatic. They appropriate, pragmatic education. Of course, not the whole of the United States, but American education is well known for its pragmatic approach. But if you go to the East, especially in China, for example, education, especially in ancient China, education is very ethical. There is the emphasis on the formation of the Tsunzi, or the perfect gentleman according to Confucius. And there is also this group of philosophers in Europe influenced by Plato, the ancient philosophy of Plato, the idealism, which is not necessarily the opposite, but somehow a contradiction to the realist approach of Aristotle. So we have the idealism of Plato, which emphasizes on the ideal, the ideal, the forms, ideas, and Aristotle and Plato, as we know it, said what we experience at the moments, the material things, the real things that we experience at the moments are not really real. These are simply copies of the real, you know, um, of the real, of the truth that is on the level of idea. So, in that sense, idealism emphasizes the idea of, um, the forms, the ideas, emphasizes the idea of reality as, somewhere out there, beyond the physical world. While in the case of realism, again, Aristotle said, "Oh, come on, what we experience are the real things. So these things that we experience are for Plato's notion, for Plato, simply illusions, copies of the absolute, of the truth, of the really, of the real thing that resides beyond what we can see and experience in reality." But anyway, going back to the example, so but the point is, again, we have different philosophical doctrines because um, again, we are coming from different backgrounds and orientations and cultural contexts. So again, to the Americans, most of the Americans, they appropriate pragmatism in the East, in China, and in other places in Asia. We emphasize the moralistic approach, the ethical approach to education, and then we also have in other places in the world, like in Europe, in France, we have idealism. Okay, so um, in this case, in this example, realism helps, shape on the curriculum and the content of education. That is again based on which emphasizes rather the importance of the physical world and practical knowledge. Okay. And third, philosophy informs teaching methods and strategies. Questions like, for example, how should we teach? Should learning be teacher or student-centered? So these questions are issues, or these are issues that philosophy helps address. That left on their own, teachers who are not, who do not have strong background in philosophy can hardly address. So again, education is not just all about the memorization of facts and figures, but it should also address questions like, again, why we educate, how should we teach, and whether learning should be teacher or student-centered and whatnot. Fourth, philosophy helps clarifies the role of the teacher and the learner. And so questions like, is the teacher a transmitter of knowledge or simply a facilitator of learning? So there's a debate about this, whether the teacher should always do the spoon feeding, we transmit knowledge and skills to our students, or the students should be left on their own. My position again in this context, if we understand education as both educare and educere, the nurturing or the bringing out and the drawing out of the latent abilities of the students, my position is sometimes, not sometimes, on the one hand, the teacher or the professor must transmit knowledge, scientific knowledge and skills to our students, because left on their own, the students can hardly master these things without the guidance of the students, like solving difficult mathematical problems, for example, or learning a particular theory and skills, in aeronautics, for example, in engineering, for example. So we need competent, certified teachers and professors to transmit this knowledge, these skills. But on the other hand, the teacher must also be a facilitator, especially in educere, especially in drawing out the latent abilities of the students, especially in allowing the students to actualize their potentialities. So in that case, we do not superimpose and force feed standards on the part of our students, especially in terms of critical thinking and reflective thinking. So in this case, the professor, the teacher, simply, on the other hand, serves as a facilitator, so that the students are motivated, empowered to, again, unleash their potential, actualize their potentialities. So questions like that, is a teacher a transmitter of knowledge or simply a facilitator of learning, um, um, uh, falls within the ambit of philosophy. It is our primary business to really, reflect on these questions. And then we also have the question, is the student a passive recipient or an active constructor of meaning? So this question is related to the first one. And our position in philosophy, my position as a philosophy professor, as a professor of philosophy of education in this case, is sometimes, on the one hand, again, the students, or in the process of educating our students or the child, on the one hand, the student, there's a certain stage or phase where the student serves as a passive recipient of knowledge. Again, that's where certified teachers, qualified professors, teach highly technical skills, highly nuanced knowledge, which again, students can hardly make sense of when left alone. But on the other hand, after teaching them some techniques, some scientific skills and knowledge, the students must also be encouraged and empowered to construct meaning on their own. So the two go hand in hand. So again, philosophy answers this question. Indeed, these roles reflect philosophical perspectives on the nature of the human person and knowledge. Fifth, philosophy encourages critical and reflective thinking. So I wish to emphasize at this point that critical thinking in philosophy is not just all about the students understanding, analyzing, and making interpretations of what they have understood. Well, yes, that's critical thinking on the one hand. But on the other hand, critical thinking also implies the ability of the student to question reality, the ability of the student to question his or her own beliefs and knowledge and attitudes and whatnot. So it's an inward thinking, it's a thinking about towards the self. So more than the interpretation, the understanding, analysis, and interpretation of reality, critical thinking also involves about questioning our own beliefs and traditions and practices. And that's also a kind of reflective thinking. So we call that reflexive thinking in critical theory. So a thinking that thinks about itself, a being questions its own way of thinking, its own practices, its own culture, its own attitudes and whatnot, you know. And before I proceed, um, um, I think one of the important aspects of education now that we need to teach to our students is the ability to be critical, especially in this modern world, wherein the business of OBE or outcomes-based education is to produce students who is to produce competent and employable, graduates who will soon become cogs of the machine, or let's say a marketable individual. So these are yeah, the one of the concerns of the educational system in the Philippines is to produce, workers, to produce employees that will obey, that would who would simply obey and follow rules without questioning them, without questioning whether to follow or not these rules. So we have experts, we have scientists, we have graduates or competent employees, who are excellent in their own professions, like an engineer, like uh, um, a scientist, or or a teacher in itself. But sometimes we lack the critical aspect of it. If you remember the banking method of education of Paulo Freire, that's how we treat education. The student is simply a receptacle of knowledge, and then our concern is, to produce automatons. Our concern is to produce students or employable graduates competence, but without, developing the moralistic aspects or the moral aspects of education. So I think there's a need also to put premium on the critical aspect of education. And that is why, again, the importance of philosophy in the entire business of education. Okay, so again, philosophy encourages critical thinking, critical and reflective thinking. Now, it must be noted that education is not just all about transmitting information, as I already explained, but about forming minds that can question, analyze, and reflect. So just to reiterate, education must also put premium on this, must also emphasize this one. In addition to, you know, um, teaching students highly technical skills and knowledge through the memorization of facts and figures, through what Paulo Freire calls the banking method of education. So when we teach students to question their own beliefs, to be able to analyze things and reflect about their belief systems, their values and attitude, again, this is one of the primary businesses of philosophy. So as we can see, philosophy is the foundation of education because, to wrap it up, philosophy provides the essential principles, values, and frameworks that guide its purpose, methods, and goals. Philosophy also helps define what knowledge is worth teaching, whether it's be theoretical or mm, ethical or you know um, practical knowledge, and how learning should occur, and the ethical responsibilities of educators. Philosophy also helps shapes, curricula, teaching strategies, and the aims of education. And then philosophy fosters critical thinking, reflective inquiry, and a deeper understanding of human development. Without philosophy, therefore, education would lack direction, coherence, and purpose. And if education lacks direction, coherence, and purpose because of the absence of philosophy, then education would simply be a mechanical process rather than a meaningful journey of human formation and transformation. So you see, if we just focus on the memorization of facts and figures, mastering knowledge and skills, education is simply, in that context, viewed as a mechanical process. But we should remember that education comes from the two Latin words educare and educere. Educare again is to bring out, to nurture students, and educere to draw out what is latent within the students themselves. And if we emphasize both of this and apply philosophy in our approach to education, then again, education becomes a meaningful journey of human formation and transformation. That's how important philosophy again in the educational process. Okay, so much for the topic on how philosophy ground education. In my next discussion, again, I will talk about the meaning and definition of the meaning and developments of sociology as a discipline, and then I'll discuss as well how sociology serves as the foundation of education. And this is because, again, the course Education 501 is titled Philosophical and Sociological Foundations of Education. So much for our discussion today. Thank you very much for your attention and have a good one, everyone.